In the spring of 1241, Europe would meet the storm it never saw coming. The morning sun rose gently over the rolling plains of Central Europe. Mist hovered above the fields like a soft, pale curtain. Birds sang, merchants opened their stalls, and the bells of distant churches called the faithful to prayer. For a moment it was peace, the kind of peace that makes people believe nothing could ever shatter it. But beyond the horizon, far past the rivers and forests, on the endless steppes of the east, a storm was rising. It carried no thunder, no rain, only the sound of hooves. From the heart of Asia, the Mongol Empire was expanding like a fire racing through dry grass. They were swift, disciplined, and unstoppable warriors, forged in wind and dust, guided by a single will. They had already burned through kingdoms that once believed themselves eternal. Now, for the first time, their gaze turned westward, toward Europe. In those days, Europe was not a united land. It was a patchwork of duchies, bishoprics, and feuding kingdoms. Every lord believed his own banners, his own god, his own borders would protect him. They fought one another more often than they prepared to defend themselves. And so when the first messengers stumbled into the cities of Poland, bloodied, terrified whispering of horsemen who came from the sunrise, few believed them. Barbarians from Asia, they said. They will fade like the wind. They didn't know that the wind was already here. In Silesia, one man listened. Henry the Pious, Duke of Silesia, stood on the high stone walls of his fortress at Legnica. The early dawn light brushed his armor, and his eyes searched the eastern horizon. A chill wind carried the smell of smoke, faint but real. His scouts had returned with grim tales, villages to the east burned to ash, children missing, priests slain. The Mongols had crossed into Poland. Henry was young, barely 40, but his heart carried the weight of an old soul. His father had died in battle. His faith had been his compass ever since. He believed that God had chosen him not for glory but for duty. The duty to protect his land, his people, and the fragile peace of Christendom. As he stood, a soldier approached him, mud on his boots, fear in his voice. "My lord, they say these riders, they do not fight like men. They vanish into smoke, then return like ghosts." Henry turned his eyes steady. "Then we will remind them that men who fight for faith do not vanish." His words were calm, but inside he felt the weight of something larger, the knowledge that he might be facing a force unlike any in Europe's history. The air that morning carried a strange stillness, as if the earth itself held its breath. Far to the east, the sound of thunder began not from clouds but from the hooves of thousands of riders. They came like shadows sweeping across the plains, banners snapping in the wind. The Mongols did not shout, they did not sing. They moved with a silence that spoke louder than any war cry. Europe was unprepared. Its knights, heavy in armor, believed in the righteousness of their cause, but they had never fought an enemy who could move faster than the wind. They prayed, they sharpened swords, but none could imagine the scale of what was coming. Henry walked through the courtyard of his castle, where men armed themselves with faith more than steel. Priests offered blessings. Mothers wept quietly behind the walls. Above it all, the bells of Legnica tolled deep and solemn, as if mourning a future not yet lost. This is not just a story about war, the narrator's voice softens, as if speaking directly to the listener. It's about faith, about courage, about the price of unity. Henry looked once more toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to burn away the mist. For a brief moment, he saw it, a thin black line cutting across the fields, glinting with metal and dust. He knew then that the stories were true. The storm had arrived. He whispered to himself, almost like a prayer, "If this is the day I die, let it be with honor." And then the sound, a deep rumble growing louder. Hooves. Thousands of them. The first riders appeared over the ridge, their banners fluttering with symbols no European eye had ever seen. Arrows gleamed in the morning sunday. The wind carried a roar, not of fear but of fate. The narrator's voice rises. Could one man's bravery stand against an empire that conquered half the world? Silence follows a heartbeat before the storm. Then, the echo of war drums the clash of steel imagined beyond the mist. And so began the day Europe met the Mongols, the Battle of Liegnitz. The sound of hooves did not fade. It grew louder, faster, as if the earth itself carried the warning. From beyond the Carpathian Mountains they came. The Mongol army moved like a living creature. disciplined, precise, and terrifyingly silent. Tens of thousands of riders, each trained from childhood to ride, shoot, and kill as one. They did not march in ranks like European armies. They flowed a tide of muscle, leather, and steel. When they advanced, it was as if the wind itself had taken shape. At their head rode Baidar, grandson of Genghis Khan, a warrior whose calm gaze could silence men before he spoke. Beside him, Kadan, fierce and impatient, his bow always within reach. And far away, unseen but always present, was Subutai, the master strategist of the Mongol Empire, a mind so sharp it could turn chaos into order and victory into inevitability. His commands crossed mountains and rivers through smoke signals, runners, and drums. To the Mongols, his word was law, even if his face was miles away. They had crossed the frozen passes of the Carpathians in winter, where lesser armies would have perished. Their horses, small, tough bred for endurance, grazed on frozen grass. Their riders slept in the saddle, ate while riding, and never broke formation. When they descended upon the plains of Poland, the earth trembled. Villages vanished overnight. Monasteries burned. Those who survived whispered of men from the east who rode with demons. To the peasants, it seemed as if hell itself had opened, and the horsemen had ridden out of its gates. In one camp, near the smoldering ruins of Krakow, Baidar stood watching the sky darken with smoke. Kadan approached his armor, streaked with mud and blood. "They run like frightened deer," Kadan muttered. Baidar didn't look at him. His voice was calm. "Let them run. Let them think we are chasing. The more they flee, the further they fall from safety." He turned his eyes sharp. "Let them chase us, brother. The moment they believe we're weak, that's when they die." Kadan smiled a cold, thin smile, just as Subutai taught. This was the essence of Mongol warfare: deception, patience, and speed. Their strategy, feigned retreat, had broken empires before. They would lure the enemy and let arrogance drive them, then surround them in a perfect circle of death. Where European knights relied on courage and armor, the Mongols relied on calculation. Every arrow was planned. Every retreat was a trap. They communicated through horns, flags, and drumbeats, each sound carrying meaning. In moments, entire regiments could turn scatter or close ranks as if moved by one mind. They fought not for glory or gold, but for order for the empire that had swallowed half the known world. And in their hearts there was no fear of death, only failure. But in the West, the story was different. Europe's knights rode heavy horses, their armor gleaming in the sunlight, symbols of faith and pride. They carried banners blessed by priests, believing that God himself rode beside them. Their swords were heavy, their steps loud. They prayed before battle, swearing to defend Christendom against any foe, but against the Mongols' speed, their strength became a burden. Every movement cost them precious seconds. Every hesitation could mean death. The two worlds could not have been more different. One fought with the weight of tradition and faith. The other fought with the precision of a storm. When the Mongols struck, they struck like lightning fast, ruthless, and without warning. When they withdrew, they melted into the landscape, leaving behind nothing but silence and the scent of ash. Their warfare was psychological as much as physical. They shattered the enemy's mind before the body ever fell. As weeks passed, word of their destruction spread like wildfire. Fleeing peasants filled the roads, dragging what little they could carry. Monks clutched their crosses, praying aloud as smoke curled from the horizon. In the ruins of a small village, a priest stood before the remnants of his chapel. The roof was gone, the altar blackened. He raised his trembling hands toward the sky and whispered, "Lord, deliver us from this terror." But the only answer was the wind. Children cried in the distance. Dogs barked at shadows. Everywhere there was the same question, what are they? No one knew where they came from. No one knew how to stop them. The narrator's tone slows heavy with awe and sorrow. They called them horsemen. They called them demons. But what they truly were was the embodiment of discipline and fear. And as the fires burned across Poland and Silesia, one truth became clear. The storm from the east was not passing through, it was coming for Europe's heart. The fires from the east still burned when Henry the Pious began to gather his army. The stories of destruction of villages turned to ash and fields trampled by hooves had spread across Poland and Bohemia like a fever. Henry knew the Mongols were coming for him next. He could not stop the storm alone, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could stand long enough for the rest of Europe to awaken. Messengers rode through the forests and over the mountains carrying his plea, "To all who still hold the cross, come. The east is burning," and they came. From the duchies of Silesia and Poland rode armored knights' banners fluttering with eagles and lions. From the German lands, men of the Teutonic Order silent, grim their black crosses, stark against white cloaks. From Bohemia, a small contingent of riders young and untested. Peasants followed too armed with pitchforks, axes, and faith. They spoke different tongues, German, Polish, Czech, Latin, but shared one prayer. In the chaos of campfires and clashing dialects, orders were shouted, armor hammered, and horses readied. Smoke rose from the camp like incense to heaven. Henry walked among them, his steps steady, though his heart carried the weight of the entire land. He saw fear in the men's eyes, but also resolve. By the flickering light of a fire, he stopped beside a group of Teutonic knights. Their leader, a broad man with a scar across his cheek, bowed. "My lord," he said in rough Polish, "our vows bind us to fight where faith is threatened. We are yours to command." Henry smiled faintly. "We may not understand each other's words," he said, "but we understand why we fight." The knight struck his chest with his fist. "For God." Henry answered softly, "And for the living." That night, the camp of Liegnitz was a city of firelight. Thousands gathered, but few spoke. The smell of iron and wet earth hung heavy. In the distance, thunder rolled, or perhaps it was the echo of hooves. Priests walked between the tents, offering blessings to trembling soldiers, Latin prayers mixed with whispered confessions. Some men sharpened their blades in silence. Others stared at the flames, seeing the faces of their families far away. Henry stood alone outside his tent, staring into the night. The air was cold, the stars distant and hard. He thought of the letters he had written that day to his wife, his children, his bishops. None were farewells, only promises. He whispered to the darkness, "If this is the end, let it mean something." He knew the truth. Europe did not understand what it faced. The Mongols were not raiders or barbarians. They were a machine of war unlike anything the West had known. Every story that reached him of feigned retreats, of lightning-fast strikes of arrows that never missed, had been dismissed by those far away as exaggerations. But Henry had seen the smoke with his own eyes. He clenched his fist. "Then let this field be the place where they finally see." The narrator's tone softens, as if time itself holds its breath. The night before the battle, the sky over Liegnitz was the color of iron. A heavy wind swept through the camp, bending torches and carrying embers into the dark. Horses shifted nervously. From beyond the hills, wolves howled, or maybe something else. The men crossed themselves and turned toward the church bells that still rang faintly in the city behind them. As dawn approached, the fires dimmed. The mist rolled in from the meadows, thick and pale, swallowing shapes and sound. When Henry stepped from his tent, the world felt smaller, hushed, as though heaven itself was watching. He looked over the valley where his banners stood, dark silhouettes in the fog. Around him, his captains waited, the Teutonic commander, the Polish knights, a handful of Bohemians. No one spoke. The silence was sacred. Finally, Henry raised his voice. "Men of Silesia, Poland, Bohemia, the enemy before us does not know mercy. They do not fight for gold or glory, they fight for conquest. But we fight for home, for faith, for every child who still sleeps without fear. If we fall today, let it be standing." A murmur rippled through the ranks, a prayer, a vow, a heartbeat turned into sound, and then the first horn. A deep, distant note that rolled through the fog like thunder. Another answered it closer this time. The soldiers turned toward the sound, hands tightening on sword hilts. The narrator's tone quickens, tension rising. At dawn, Europe held its breath. From the white mist ahead, shapes began to emerge, small at first, then countless. Horsemen, shadows moving like a tide. The riders from the east had arrived at Liegnitz. The mist over Liegnitz had barely lifted when the first arrows fell. They came not as a volley, but as a storm, a black rain that hissed through the morning air. The sound was endless, whistling, cracking, striking. Shields lifted, men shouted, horses screamed. Within moments, the sky seemed alive with death. The Mongol archers rode in wide arcs across the plain, their movements too fast, too fluid to follow. From the fog they appeared and vanished like phantoms, drawing, loosing, disappearing again. Each rider carried dozens of arrows and none missed their mark. The European lines shuddered under the onslaught. "Hold the line," Henry's voice rang out firm and commanding. "Hold, shields high!" But the air was thick with smoke, black choking clouds billowing from burning grass the Mongols had set aflame. It rolled across the field, hiding friend and foe alike. From within that haze came the thunder of hooves. The Mongols struck fast and hard, slicing into the flanks, then retreating before the knights could counter. Their horns blared one long note to charge, two to vanish. It was chaos sculpted into art. The narrator's voice rises with the rhythm of battle. The clash of faith and fury had begun. Henry's knights, encased in armor, pushed forward with sheer strength. Their banners glimmered through the smoke, crosses of gold against crimson cloth. When they met the Mongols head-on, the earth itself seemed to quake. Steel rang against steel. Arrows splintered against shields. The cries of men and beasts blended into one unbroken roar. "Push them back," shouted a Teutonic knight, his sword slick with blood. "We have them now," another yelled, blind to the trap unfolding around them. For a moment it seemed true. The Mongols were falling back, withdrawing into the mist, abandoning their dead. Henry saw it and hope ignited in him. "They're breaking," he called. "Forward, press them," his captains obeyed. The knights of Silesia and Poland surged ahead, their heavy horses pounding across the open field. The Teutonic banners followed, white crosses cutting through the smoke, but it was then at the height of their courage that the trap was sprung. From the distant ridge, Baidar watched the European advance with cold precision. He turned to Kadan. "Now," he said. The drums sounded deep and hollow, echoing across the valley. The retreating Mongol riders wheeled around, dividing into two sweeping wings that closed like jaws. Arrows rained down once more, this time from every direction. The knights, stretched thin and blinded by smoke, had no formation left to hold. Confusion tore through the ranks. Men shouted in languages no one understood. Horses reared and fell. The once solid line of armor and faith broke apart like shattered glass. Henry's horse stumbled over a fallen knight, throwing him hard to the ground. He rose, dazed, his sword still in hand. All around him his men fought and died in small circles, surrounded, cut off, each one isolated in the storm. The narrator's tone deepens, heavy with tragedy. Faith met fury, and fury did not yield. A Mongol rider charged at Henry. The Duke turned, swinging his sword with the strength of desperation, striking the man down. Another came, then another. Arrows clattered against his armor, piercing his cloak. Still he fought. For Silesia he roared, voice breaking through the chaos. For faith, he drove forward, cutting through the smoke until the blade in his hand grew heavy and his arm trembled. Then came a sharp cry, a sound of pain and disbelief. An arrow struck between the plates of his armor. He staggered, dropping to one knee. His vision blurred fire-blood sky. He looked up and for an instant saw the cross of his banner still standing amid the wreckage. He smiled faintly. "Not yet," he whispered. But the circle closed. The Mongol riders converged like shadows, swallowing the light. Steel flashed. The sound of hooves and screams became one. When it was over, silence crept across the field. The wind returned cold and empty. Smoke drifted low, carrying the smell of iron and ash. The once green meadow of Liegnitz was a sea of broken lances and still bodies. The narrator's voice slows, soft but resonant. When the dust settled, the banner of Silesia lay silent. Henry's body was found among his men, surrounded but unbroken. His sword was still in his hand, his face calm as if in prayer. Around him, the survivors of both sides stood motionless for a long moment, the living staring at the cost of their victory and defeat. And then, without a word, the Mongols rode on, leaving the field, leaving Europe trembling in their wake. When the Mongols rode away from Liegnitz, they left behind not just a battlefield, but a silence that carried across all of Europe. Smoke rose for days, drifting over the valleys and rivers, a dark reminder of what had been lost. Crows circled above the fields where knights and peasants alike had fallen. Among them lay Henry the Pious, the last duke who dared to stand against the storm. The news traveled fast. Messengers reached Krakow, Prague, Vienna, and beyond, carrying word that the armies of Christendom had been broken. The letters spoke of fire of slaughter of the Duke of Silesia, who had died with his sword still in his hand. Panic rippled through Europe. Bells tolled in cities far from the smoke. Kings called for councils, bishops declared days of mourning. In the taverns and churches, people whispered that the end of the world had come. But then, nothing. The Mongols did not come further west. Their armies, unstoppable and merciless, suddenly turned away back toward the steppes. Europe waited for another wave, but it never came. In time, word spread that far to the east, the Great Khan Ögedei had died, and the Mongol princes had returned home to choose a new ruler. The narrator's voice softens. Perhaps it wasn't Europe that stopped the Mongols, it was fate itself. In the months that followed, the survivors of Liegnitz returned to the ashes. The fields were blackened, the churches burned the air, still thick with the scent of war. But the people began to rebuild. Stone by stone, they raised their homes again. Brick by brick, they rebuilt their churches. And in the center of Legnica, they placed a cross upon the ground where Henry had fallen, not as a monument to victory, but as a tribute to courage. Old men told the story to their children of the Duke who stood when others ran, of the knights who fought against impossible odds, of the day when the East and West met in a storm of fire and faith. In time, Henry became more than a memory. He became a symbol not of triumph, but of endurance. In a monastery years later, a chronicler dipped his quill in ink and wrote, "They died not in defeat, but in defiance." Across Europe, the lesson of Liegnitz lingered. Nations that once fought each other began to look eastward with new eyes. The kingdoms of Poland, Bohemia, and Hungary realized that alone they were fragile, but together perhaps they could endure. The people, scarred but unbroken, understood something greater than politics or power. They had seen the face of annihilation and lived. The narrator's tone deepens, filled with quiet reverence. Courage is not measured by victory, but by standing when there's no hope left. Liegnitz became a name carried in prayer, a story told by candlelight. It reminded Europe that even in the face of terror there could be dignity, that even defeat could shine with a strange kind of glory. Years later, when travelers passed through the plains of Silesia, they spoke of the wind that never ceased to blow across the open fields. They said it carried the voices of those who had fallen, knights, peasants, monks, whispering through the grass, a chorus of faith and fury still echoing after centuries. In the final moments, the narrator's voice grows stronger, rising with emotion not of sorrow but of resolve. So remember Liegnitz, a name carved not in triumph but in honor. Remember Henry the Pious, who faced the storm when no one else would. Remember that courage, even when outnumbered, can still shape history. The soundscape fades, the echo of hooves, the low murmur of wind across the plains. A distant church bell tolls once, twice its tone, heavy but clear. The voice lowers, calm and reflective. The Mongols left, Europe survived. And in the heart of every man who still dares to stand against fear, Liegnitz lives on. The wind rises again, carrying the faint sound of prayer, and then silence. Only the bell remains, its echo fading into the horizon.